When we talk about the horrors committed by the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, it is common to remember Nazi concentration camps or Soviet gulags. But there is a lesser-known, equally disturbing story that took place in a small Romanian prison between 1949 and 1952. An experiment designed to destroy not only the body, but the very soul of those who dared to oppose communism. This is the story of the Pitești Prison Experiment, a dark chapter in Romanian history that still resonates in the memories of those who survived. In 1944, after the end of World War II, Romania fell under the influence of the Soviet Union. Communism was firmly established in the country, and any type of opposition was crushed mercilessly. Under the watch of the Securitate, the regime's secret police, thousands of people were arrested, including intellectuals, priests, political dissidents, and especially young students. These students, many of whom were sympathizers of movements like the Iron Guard, a far-right nationalist group, were considered enemies of the state. Any trace of opposition had to be eradicated, but traditional imprisonment methods were not enough for the leaders of the Romanian Communist Party. Thus, the idea of re-education through torture was born, a process that sought not only to physically eliminate opponents but also to destroy their minds and souls. The place chosen for this experiment was Pitești Prison, a facility in central Romania. Here, between 1949 and 1952, one of the most brutal torture experiments in modern history took place. Under the command of the Securitate, a man named Eugen Țurcanu, a former member of the Iron Guard who had switched his loyalty to the Communist Party, was selected to lead the re-education program. Țurcanu, who had once been a political prisoner himself, became one of the regime's most ruthless executioners. His mission, to re-educate prisoners by forcing them to renounce their political and religious beliefs, betray their comrades, and fully embrace communist ideology. The re-education process in Pitești Prison was as violent as it was dehumanizing. Prisoners were subjected to a combination of physical and psychological torture. One of the most terrifying aspects was that the tortures were not only inflicted by the guards but also by the prisoners themselves, who, under Țurcanu's direction, became executioners of their fellow inmates. The physical tortures were brutal: beatings until bones broke, sleep deprivation, constant hunger, and endless blows. Prisoners were forced to stand for hours or even days while enduring relentless beatings. Those who fell or disobeyed were beaten even more. But it was not just about inflicting physical pain. Psychological torture was designed to destroy any trace of faith or morality in the prisoners. Christians were forced to renounce their faith. Parodies of religious rituals were organized, where, for example, communion was simulated using urine or excrement instead of sacred elements. They were forced to betray their friends, confess to crimes they had never committed, and actively participate in the torture of other prisoners. Every day, the prisoners were emotionally broken, making them feel that they could not trust even their cellmates. One of the darkest aspects of the Pitești experiment was the psychological torture. Prisoners were not only forced to endure physical pain, they were made to become monsters themselves. Those who were re-educated through torture were, in turn, required to torture other prisoners. This created an atmosphere of total distrust, where no one could trust anyone, and it also eroded the prisoners' identities. Betrayal and violence became tools for survival. Many prisoners, after suffering weeks or months of torture, ended up participating in the torture of their fellow inmates simply to avoid a worse fate. Most of those who survived this peculiar re-education program through torture went insane or committed suicide. A minority became cold-blooded killers serving the cause. The rest perished, victims of the abuses and unleashed violence of the executioners, who were, at the same time, their own fellow prisoners. If Pitești from the outside appeared to be just another prison, the tortures practiced inside were far from conventional. Țurcanu's men devised unimaginable torments. The cruelty with which they administered the beatings had never been seen before. The writer and survivor Eugen Țurcanu was one who lived to tell about it, and he did so in these shocking terms in his Memories of Pitești. They stripped me, stuffed socks into my mouth with the handle of a spoon until I started to bleed, tied my hands behind my back with a rope and my feet with another rope. What followed cannot be described. Blows to the head to brutalize me, blows to the face to disfigure me, thousands of blows to the back, under the ribs, in the plexus, on the soles of my feet. Dozens of fainting spells, and so it went on, again and again, for hours. While the guard watched. They broke my bones, lungs, and liver, they danced, shod, on my bones, on my lungs. The type of prisoners who most aroused Țurcanu's homicidal spirit were Christians, especially seminarians. With them, he went all out. Virgil Irunca, a renowned post-war literary critic and one of the greatest critics of the Romanian communist regime, recorded it this way in the Pitești Phenomenon, the definitive work on this silent genocide. Țurcanu's imagination ran wild against the believers who refused to renounce God. Some were baptized every morning in the following way: their heads were submerged in buckets filled with urine and fecal remains. To continue the torment indefinitely, they would pull their heads out so they could breathe and then submerge them back into that sludge. One of those baptized, who had been systematically subjected to this torture, developed a tic that lasted about 2 months, much to the delight of the re-educators. Every morning, he would go himself to stick his head in the chamber pot. This cycle of torture and betrayal shattered the prisoners' psyches. By losing their humanity, they became shadows of what they once were. After 3 years of horror, in 1952, the communist regime decided to suspend the experiment. But they did not do so because they considered it immoral. Rather, they feared that the extreme brutality unleashed in Pitești was too much even by the regime's own standards. The communist government realized that the atrocities committed in Pitești could turn against them. Even within the ranks of the Securitate, some began to question whether the methods being used were creating more enemies than allies. When the experiment was dismantled, the direct perpetrators of the tortures were put on trial. Eugen Țurcanu, the principal executor of Pitești's horrors, was arrested and charged with the crimes committed in the prison. But this trial was more an attempt by the regime to cover up its responsibility than a true act of justice. Țurcanu was sentenced to death and executed in 1954, along with several of his accomplices. However, the communist regime tried to present them as isolated criminals, disconnecting the Communist Party authorities from the atrocities committed in Pitești. Thus, Pitești's executioners paid with their lives, but the real machinery behind the experiment, the communist regime, continued on its path, at least for a few more decades. The Pitești experiment remains one of the darkest chapters in Romania's history. For decades, the communist regime tried to hide what had happened there. It wasn't until after the Romanian Revolution of 1989 and the fall of communism that the truth began to emerge. Today, Pitești's legacy is a brutal reminder of how far human cruelty can go when power is absolute. The victims and survivors of Pitești continue to fight to keep alive the memory of those who died under torture. It serves as a warning that we must never forget the horrors that can arise when hatred, fanaticism, and political repression become tools of the state. Pitești was a factory of horror, designed to destroy bodies and souls. It is a dark chapter in 20th century history that we must never forget. Not only for the victims but also for the danger posed by dehumanization and abuse of power in any society.